Why doesn't the United States ally with Russia to counter China? This is a question raised by a netizen. We need to consider whether the U.S. allying with Russia against China is mere fantasy or a viable option. Of course, it's nothing but sheer fantasy. Hasn't the U.S. thought of this? They have, and many netizens have thought about it for them. However, when the matter is scrutinized more closely, one must contend with the reality that China's momentum on the global stage is considerable, and the contradictions between the U.S. and Russia are difficult to reconcile in the short term. In fact, when the U.S. realized that China is a potential competitor, it was in the year 2011. President Obama, at the APEC summit, officially proposed the return to the Asia-Pacific strategy, aiming to strengthen American economic, security, and political influence in the Asia-Pacific region in response to the rapidly rising geopolitical challenges there. Who could the challenger be other than China? Now, take the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 as the starting point and the year 2011 as a dividing line. And let's trace the changes in the global situation from the American perspective. We can clearly understand that the so-called alliance with Russia against China is just a result of wishful thinking by storytellers. First stage, in December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, ending the 44-year confrontation with the U.S. From this point, the U.S. emerged as the world's strongest superpower, basking in the glory of victory. Let's take a look at some simple numbers. In 1991, the U.S. GDP was more than $6 trillion. At that time, the second-ranked country, Japan, had a GDP of more than $3.5 trillion. The newly established Russian Federation had a GDP of just over $500 billion, while China had an even lower $379.4 billion, not making it into the top 10 globally. Think about it. At that time, did the U.S. take China seriously? They probably weren't overly concerned about Russia, let alone China. To the U.S., it was countries like Japan, then West Germany, and a host of rapidly developing European countries that posed the greatest concern during that period. Particularly with the establishment of the EU on November 1, 1993, and the official issuance and use of the euro on January 1, 1999, aiming for a strategic political and economic integration of Europe, constantly tugged at America's nerves. After its establishment, the EU had a GDP of $7.16 trillion in 1994, while at the same time, the U.S. GDP was $7.29 trillion. Wouldn't Americans be anxious about a scenario where the European economy, after integration, amounted to 98% of that of the U.S., with even the possibility to surpass it at any time? Thus, in 1999, the U.S. interfered in the Yugoslavia War, bombing Kosovo. The most direct result was the devaluation of the euro. Fast forward to 2003, the U.S. and its allies ignited the Second Gulf War, which brought down Saddam Hussein and interrupted euro-denominated oil trades. The U.S. also constantly promoted NATO's military organization to expand eastwards, exacerbating relations between Russia and the EU, creating regional conflicts. This led to European countries being tied to the U.S. regarding security issues, making it the most unstable factor for the EU, thereby ending the European dream of unification and the desire to break free from U.S. control in politics, military, and economy. So, between 1991 and 2011, about 20 years, what was the U.S. strategic focus? It was to contain the EU, to prevent it from strengthening politically and economically, and possibly threatening America's supremacy. How could the U.S. be bothered about China at that time? Even more crucially, U.S.-China trade volume grew from $80.4 billion in 2001 to $446.7 billion in 2011. During this period, Americans were quite comfortable because China's industries were mainly low-end industrial products and minerals export-focused. Americans just needed to export high-tech products to China and exchange them for cheap domestic goods. The profit margin here was substantial. Most household items in the U.S. were provided by China. The economic complementarity between China and the U.S. during this period was excellent, and Americans had no thought of containing China. Instead, they wanted China to be their industrial vassal, specifically for manual labor and basic tasks. Moving to the second stage, 2011, and especially in 2010, something major happened. China surpassed Japan to become the world's second-largest economy, with a GDP of $587 trillion. At this point, the U.S. started to take notice of China. With the old number 2 in place, the strategy of containing Europe could be changed to containing China. This is why in 2011, Obama's return to the Asia-Pacific plan emerged. It's true that in 2011, the U.S. began to pay attention to China more, but there were other special circumstances that resulted in the containment policy against China amounting to little more than a lot of noise and not a lot of action. For instance, in 2011, China's general trade import and export amounted to USD 1.9 trillion, representing 52.8%. Processing trade import and export were USD 1.3 trillion, 36.1%. In short, China were still not strong, as China's trade structure was dominated by primary processed products, low-end appliances, and mineral resources. With such a trade structure, China could neither affect the U.S. technological hegemony nor deprive them of what they needed from China. The U.S. fell into a quagmire in Afghanistan since 2001, and then it instigated Georgia to go to war with Russia in 2008, followed by indirectly initiating the Syrian civil war in 2011 to prevent Russian influence from entering the Middle East. America's contradictions with Russia intensified, pushing Russia into a corner. The aforementioned factors meant that even though Obama proposed the return to Asia-Pacific in 2011, it was not as simple as just saying, "You want to refocus." First, the U.S. need to withdraw from other commitments and reconcile with Russia to be able to contain China. So, on one hand, China wasn't strong enough at the time for the U.S. to take very seriously, and on the other, the U.S. was stuck in the Middle East and at loggerheads with Russia, rendering the containment of China and the Asia-Pacific strategy virtually void. Third stage. It was 3 major events in this stage that truly pressed America's panic button. In 2013, China proposed the Belt and Road Initiative, connecting the economic circles of East Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, and threatening to break America's traditional maritime trade system. This indicated China's refusal to settle for the status of a regional economic powerhouse. They were eyeing the spot of the global economic leader. America couldn't tolerate this. In May 2015, China launched the Made in China 2025 plan, signifying the goal of industrial upgrades and transition to high-tech industries, sectors long monopolized by the West. America had comfortably relied on this technological control. Now that China was moving into this terrain, it was infringing on the U.S. cake. On December 25, 2015, the establishment of the AIIB marked a significant move for the internationalization of the renminbi and a symbolic event for Chinese capital going global. This move was akin to the EU's euro issuance in 1999. Though it posed no short-term threat to the dollar, it at least signaled China's challenge to the U.S. dollar hegemony. If unsettled, then act. Hence, the sweeping U.S.-China trade war commenced in 2018. Until 2023, U.S. oppression of China has gone beyond trade sanctions, corporate sanctions, official sanctions, technology restrictions, biological warfare, and so forth. Therefore, online, there's been various sarcastic rhetoric. Why doesn't the U.S. ally with Russia to contain China? The war between Russia and Georgia in 2008 due to U.S. support, the Syrian civil war in 2011 to cut off Russia from the Middle East, and the war between Russia and Ukraine stoked in 2022, all these times involved Russia, all invaded by U.S. influence, and now you think of allying with Russia? Besides, if America wants to make up with Russia, does that mean NATO, established primarily to counter the Soviet Union, now Russia, should be disbanded? How would the U.S. settle its previous engagements? Would they offer any generous compensation to appease Russia? If the U.S. reconciled with Russia, would their European allies need to fully mend ties with Russia as well? If the U.S. and Russia made peace, wouldn't the European powers possibly go ahead and align with Russia without U.S. approval? To counter China, would NATO need to be dissolved, and might there be the risk of losing Europe as an ally? America would never sit still for such a loss-making deal. The concept of the United States forming an alliance with Russia to counterbalance China appears to be more of a theoretical conjecture rather than a feasible strategy in current geopolitical dynamics. The rapid economic growth and increasing global influence of China are well-recognized realities within the international community. While some observers may not fully acknowledge the extent of China's ascent, the situation underlines that the interests of the U.S. may be better served by finding a balance between competition and engagement with China. It is in the broader interest of global stability and progress for the United States to seek a relationship with China that emphasizes constructive engagement and managed rivalry, an approach that encourages collaboration on shared global challenges while addressing economic, security, and diplomatic concerns could be mutually beneficial. This principle of pragmatic interaction may offer a more sustainable path forward for Sino-American relations in the long term. Thanks. Please don't hesitate to like, subscribe, share, and support the Knowledge Nook.